Hello and welcome. I'm Frank Jacob, writer, producer, and director of Packing for Mars. In the 3 or so months since releasing Packing for Mars, new revelations have come to light about the red planet, and we've also encountered individuals with corroborating evidence to further support the premise of our film. One such revelation was being contacted by the person who you could say was directly responsible for my having begun the whole journey of making this film in the first place. The mind behind what is surely among the most legendary conspiracies ever to have become urban myth in modern times, Alternative 3. I'm speaking, of course, of none other than the author and creative genius, Leslie Watkins. Since very little is known about him, I was eager to meet. So we decided to have an informal discussion online to connect some of the dots. What you're about to see is kind of an historic event, being that neither of us knew of the other, had no contact prior to the release of Packing for Mars, and as serendipity has it, a mere 15 days after the release of our film, Mr. Watkins reissued his own new and updated version of Alternative 3. It's the first time the book has been reissued in almost 40 years. Talk about parallel timelines. So without further ado, let's meet Mr. Watkins. It's such an honor to meet you, Les. I'm really glad that we finally connected.
Oh, so am I. My goodness gracious me. And the timing is, as we've said so often in emails, pure serendipity, my friend. Serendipity.
Absolutely.
No other word for it.
Absolutely. I was just so amazed and surprised when Graham got in touch with us, and so pleased that we were able to connect like this. I had no way of knowing this was going to happen. And I think that's something that the people that are watching this should know, that none of this was planned. We live in our own worlds, and for me, your book Alternative 3 was an inspiration which I carried around with me a long time, and I didn't do anything about it until just recently. And go figure, as soon as we have something to show, you show up with a re-release of Alternative 3.
That, again, we can thank Graham for, because it was his idea to redo it. And we've had to update it, parts of it, obviously.
Yes.
Because things that happened 40 years ago are slightly different these days.
Yes, yes. Well, I reread it again after all these years. I still had it in my mind. It kind of seared itself into my brain, and I didn't even reference it. And to be quite honest, when I was making Packing for Mars, it was so kind of like infused in my consciousness. And I had a digital copy of it. I decided to get back into it. And I thought, I'll just check out a couple of chapters, refresh myself on it. And lo and behold, I couldn't put it down. I was just reading, and it's one of those page turners, you just can't stop reading it to find out where it'll lead next.
The funny thing is, Frank, that it's 40 years pretty well since I wrote it. And really, because of your interest, I have just reread it. And even I was amazed by it. I was quite shocked by some of the things in it, actually. I had not realized how close to the truth I was actually getting at that stage.
Well,
and it was rather disturbing looking back on it. Well, because things have happened since which proved that I thought I was making things up. I'm not psychic, but apparently I was not just making things up. I was just reporting what was really secretly going on. How I knew it was going on, I don't know. I can't understand it. I'm just a journalist. I don't pretend to understand the occult or how messages telepathically get transferred, but obviously something went on. I was concerned. Well, do you want to know how the thing came about in the first place?
Oh yeah, I have a lot of questions for you, Les. But
okay, well, we're not doing the interview yet.
Oh yeah, we're doing it. Well, we don't have to think of this as an interview. It's more of a nice chat between two gentlemen.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
And I just I just think that it's just, for me, some of your stories, they seem so current now. I mean, you wrote about global warming. and the Unexploded Man, I believe it is, you write about a Syrian war and refugees on a pilgrimage to Europe and destabilizing the European Union. I mean, it's almost as if you saw the future. I mean, come on. Level with me, Les. Are you a time traveler?
Yeah, I was born in the year 20,096.
See, now that
and I lived until 3072. I don't know how old that made me at the time, but I was pretty ancient by the time I'd finished my first session on this world.
I see. So you teleported back into our time here. And, you know, let me... I mean, there's so many stories and myths surrounding this novel. You know, I mean, the whole idea of it written as a fiction and, you know, turning out to be something that you totally stumbled into in a way. I mean, a lot of people are skeptical of that story, you should know. You know, there's been books written about your book is such a classic that books have been written about your book, you know, and
yeah.
And some of them, like, I think you mentioned Jim Keith, you know, the American journalist that kind of...
Yeah, that's right.
Sort of debunked, he's got a book called The Case Study on Alternative 3, and he sort of, he sets about how to debunk your stories, you know, but in the end, there's a really interesting quote by him. I even have written it down. He says, as much as, you know, it's all like debunkable, what baffles him is there's only one problem. He goes, while perfectly secure in my knowledge, the TV show and book are basically yellow journalism using scare tactics to make a pound. I'm a little shocked to realize that at most levels anyway, the revelations of Alternative 3 are true. So, you know, how can that be, you know? So that's where we can start. I think, you know, how does...
One thing I'm going to interrupt you there, Frank, because there's one thing that you possibly do not know about the Jim Keith setup. Jim Keith had his books, two of them, really criticizing Alternative 3, published by Illuminate Press. I had a phone call from Ron Bond, and this is checkable on the internet. I had a phone call from Ron Bond, who really was Illuminate Press. And he was the boss man, and he was a one-man band almost, saying, I would love to reproduce or republish Alternative 3. Can we do business? Well, my agent had retired by then, and the guy who took over from him was a bit of a clown, and he had been contacted by Ron Bond, and Ron Bond said to me, I didn't quite know how to handle this agent you've got in England, because he treated me like cold potatoes and didn't want to know about me, so can I deal directly with you? And I was delighted. I said, yes, of course you can. And in fact, he was so serious, he actually sent me an advance on payment, advance payment on the book. Then I got a message from him to say that he was so excited, he just about finished the book, and all he had to do now was get a really good cover for it to make it look good and sell well. 10 days later, the news came around the world. Ron Bond was dead. He'd been to a Mexican restaurant. He'd been food poisoning. And he got home, he was unwell, and he died within hours. No. And that book was never republished again. That was the same, and he had been attracted to Alternative 3, actually by Jim Keith, I think, because he produced both of Keith's books.
Right.
But he then got intrigued by the book himself, and I think he read it, and he thought, hell, there's possibilities here. And he wasn't able to do it. He'd almost completed it when he died very, very suddenly and dramatically. And he was a lovely guy. And I was in contact with some of his friends over there. This is all on the internet. Ron Bond, his name was, and the book did not get published. and it would not have been republished again if Graham hadn't suggested it. Maybe, I don't know, 8-10 months ago, and we just got down and got cracking on it, and there we are. That was a sequel to the Ron Bond sudden death, which shocked everybody because he wasn't very old. He was, I think, early 40s, Ron, and he'd already paid a chunk for the book, and it never came out.
What a shame. What a story.
Yeah, well, that is absolutely true. And what's more, his death can be checked on the internet. He just went out one evening with his family, actually, and he was the only one who was taken ill. But Mexican restaurant, no, hours later, he was dead.
Unbelievable.
End of book. That was the story.
Well, it's one of those strange anomalies that are part of this story. And
well, it was as if, I'm not suggesting it was done deliberately or that anybody poisoned him to stop Alternative 3, but it was just one of those quirky things that seemed to have dogged this book all the way through.
yes.
I mean, I certainly had my home telephone bugged for quite some time. And after it came out, I think I told you this before.
I want to take you back a little bit further to, since there's so little known about really how this all started. It started obviously with the television show with Christopher Miles and David Ambrose. Now, did you know these guys, or tell us, the story?
No, I'd never heard. Well, I knew Miles by name because his father, Sir Bernard Miles, was a well-known British character who actually opened and created the Mermaid Theatre, which was quite a famous theatre in England. But Christopher Miles, no, I didn't know. David Ambrose, I never heard of. And I knew nothing about that program until it was screened. But the intriguing thing here, though, Frank, is that I watched the program and I thought, my golly, that fills in some of the blanks that have been puzzling me for a little while. Why are the authorities, particularly American authorities, so clamped down on the subject of UFOs? I mean, it's obvious that there are UFOs. During the last war, fighter pilots from Britain coming back from, bomber pilots rather, coming back from Germany, were reporting what they called Foo Fighters. These were strange craft flying alongside them, monitoring what they were doing. And these men weren't idiots, and they reported them, and all these reports were swept aside. Somewhere about, I forget the date now, it was 1968, I think, somewhere about 5 million Americans told a Gallup poll that they believed in, there were UFOs, they'd seen them. 5 million Americans. A poll has recently been taken, and that figure has now swollen to 80 million. 80 million Americans believe they have seen or have good reason to believe in UFOs.
Yeah.
So why were the American authorities so desperately keen to deny, as they did, the existence of UFOs? I don't think it was for any malicious intent. I think it was for a benevolent one, actually. They were frightened that there was likely to be an invasion of this world from outer space. And they did not want to start a mass panic. So they played down the whole idea of UFOs. No, you've imagined it. People have imagined it. It's a load of nonsense. And you done well, it wasn't a load of nonsense. I mean, among the people who reported UFOs, I think I indicated this in the book, actually, was Jimmy Carter. And he reported it to two authorities, one an authority for aerial phenomena, and the other one was an international UFO bureau. And he made these two reports of having seen, this was before he became president, he'd seen UFOs, and he was very concerned about them. After he became president, though, he denied all knowledge of that, and he joked. He played it down. He said, "Oh, no. What I think I saw was just a light guiding me to the Californian primaries." Was it because by that time he'd been briefed on what was really going on and what the real worries were? So I don't think there was anything evil in the intention of the American government, or indeed the Russian government, in playing down. It was to avert any mass panic at all. There was another thing that puzzled me before I saw the program, actually, and I couldn't work this one out. When I was a kid at school, we lived 30 miles north of London during the last war. The big war, the last World War II. And the town I was in was hit by V2 rockets. And in fact, one of my classmates was orphaned when I was in woodwork class, would you believe? Me, of all people, the most clumsy, cack-handed man in the world in woodwork class. And we were there when there was a terrific rump one afternoon. And one of my classmates got home to find his home was no longer there. Instead of that, there was an enormous hole in the ground. And he was suddenly an orphan, and he had no home. Now, that was in 1944. And yet, when they sent the first living creatures up into space, this was in 1948, they sent a rocket up. What sort of rocket do they use? For the first living creatures in space, they used a V2 rocket, which was an out-of-date relic of World War II. And by then, the whole technology had advanced so much. Why did they use such an old one? Why? What? I'll tell you, I think that at that stage, they were far more advanced than we were allowed to know. And that was a bit of a PR stunt. And of course, the poor victim of the PR stunt was a rhesus monkey called Albert, who actually, on that first journey, he suffocated to death. They didn't need to use a V2 rocket. They had much more sophisticated things by then. There were all sorts of queries. And a number of things of that ilk niggled away at me for a little while. And by chance, I watched that television program. I don't watch a great deal of television, to be honest. And I thought, hey, this begins to put the dots together. And that really got me very interested in what was happening. And so that's really what got me going. It certainly was based on the television program, of course. And I thought that it was extremely well done. But I didn't take it seriously. And I did not expect people to take my book seriously. Because I thought, look, I've made a lot of this up.
Right. So
the idea
when you saw the television program,
groups of people, batches of people, being taken from this world to go and serve as slaves on Mars, with the moon becoming some sort of transit camp. No, it's just so ridiculous. Nobody would ever believe that. But they did believe it. And I was quite amazed when they did. And, well, you know what happened afterwards, of course. There were a lawful backlash. There was a backlash of fear, anxiety, and panic, which I certainly did not want to create. And that was why I did repeatedly deny that it was fact. But people didn't believe me. But since then, 40 years later, I realize now that an awful lot of what I thought I'd made up was actually happening. I mean, we talk about batch consignment. Well, look what happened in Oregon. And that wasn't all that long ago. I don't know, the date was somewhere about, I've got it here. Yes, here we are, 1975, Oregon. 20 people mysteriously disappeared en masse from a little community in Oregon. Those people, it was established later, had attended a meeting at which, a meeting which had been organized by a man and a woman who had given false names, were never seen again, and they told these people that they were going to be saved. Their souls were going to be They were going to be taken somewhere in Colorado, actually, to a special camp where they would be prepared to go to a new life on a different planet. Batch consignment, I don't know. It just struck me as too unlikely a coincidence. How can these things happen, Frank? What do you think about that?
Well, I wanted to ask you about the sources. Obviously, you after you saw the program, did you actually approach Christopher Miles and David Ambrose for some of their material, or did you just start?
No. What happened here was my agent contacted me actually and said, would you be interested in doing it? And I think he was a thought leader because I was extremely interested in doing it. I hadn't met, as I told you, Ambrose or Miles before. And he did the arrangements with Anglia Television. I called them Scepter Television because I was not exactly polite about one of the senior executives at, Scepter Television, which is really Anglia Television. And they arranged to see it again, a special showing, and they sent me the script. I've never spoken to Miles. I don't know Miles. I've met David Ambrose only once, and that was when I bought him lunch at my club in London, which was Scribe's Cellar. And during that lunch, I said, now I'm going to possibly have to take some liberties with your book, with your script, but any ideas you got for improving it, expanding it, because it had to be expanded enormously, I'd love to hear from you. And I never heard another word. And I've never spoken with David, he's never contacted me, and I never heard from him again.
Wow.
And so I went ahead and I wrote the book, and that was all there was to it as far as I was concerned. So I'd love to have had cooperation from them, but I didn't get any cooperation at all. I did have their original script. They knew that. And the deal was that they were going to get some of the proceeds from the book. And beyond that, there was just no liaison at all.
Well, I think the sources, what makes me ask that question is because obviously to expand on the screenplay, you had to reach, a lot more, you had to do a lot more research and pull a lot more source material out. And
oh, yes,
I'm really curious about some of the source material because there's a lot of, there's this whole thing with this Island 3, that was written by this guy, Dr. Gerard O'Neill, which was kind of...
Yeah, Gerard O'Neill, that was an intriguing one, actually, because Gerard O'Neill came out with this, I think it was 1975, 76, about then, about the time that they were working on the Alternative Free television program. And he also came out with something that startled the American government. There's no question about this. This was reported in the Los Angeles Times, by the way. He pointed out that the population of this world was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there wouldn't be enough room eventually to sustain all the people. So he had an idea of, he called it Island 3. And not Alternative 3, Island 3. That was just pure chance, I think. And his vision was to create artificial worlds which would be actually floating in space. And he actually went on record in the Los Angeles Times as saying, the technology is already there to do this. NASA knows how to do this already. And 7 days later, and it was a remarkable bit of speed, a bill was rushed through in America. It was really a suppression bill, making it absolutely illegal for any journalist, such as this guy from the Los Angeles Times, to use any information which had been provided in private to the government, use it and publish it. And what was more, this was real suppression of the press. Any journalist who broke that regulation, that rule, that law, could go to jail for up to I think it was 6 or 7 years, I think it was, 7 years. Now, that was as a direct result of what O'Neill had told the Los Angeles Times. I mean, it was quite bizarre.
So that's,
why?
That's a real...
Why were they so secretive about it?
Right. So that really did take place then, and that's part of the thing that, you know, you wrote a lot of this stuff into the novel that really did happen. And
oh yes.
Is there like, so I mean, I've noticed that a lot of your material is kind of, it has this sort of, it plays with reality. It's kind of like a psychological manipulation, which I think, which I dig, which I think is, you know, it's sort of forcing people to look at what is real and what is fake. Is this kind of like your, would you say this is part of your writing style, or this is a theme that intrigues you, or what made you set out?
It's certainly a theme that intrigues me, but I also did a fair bit of research as well, in that I thought, well, if the moon is going to be used as a transit camp, now how are we going to do this? Obviously, if I were organizing it, which I certainly haven't got the technical ability to do, and I was going to use the moon as a transit camp, I would sooner do it in part of the moon that could not normally be seen from Earth. All right, so we're looking at the dark side of the moon, as we call it here. Now, what is on the dark side of the moon? Well, first of all, if you're going to build a base there, you need somewhere big and somewhere flat. And most of the moon isn't flat, it's mountainous. It's great big humps all over the place. But I discovered on the far side of the moon, there was a place called Archimedes, the Archimedes crater. Now, the Archimedes crater has got a diameter of about 50 miles, and it's a huge flat area. And it's flat for the simple reason that it's surrounded by mountains, and over the millions of years, lava from those mountains have rolled down into the crater, and they flattened it out. So here we have a 50-mile diameter area, absolutely flat on the dark side of the moon. And I thought, hey, yeah, that's the right place. Archimedes. That's why in the book, the astronauts and all the other people land up at Archimedes base, as I call it. So that was the sort of research which I was putting into it to make it more realistic and to give it a bit of credibility. Not that I wanted to scare the hell out of people, because that wasn't the idea at all. It was just to make the book more acceptable. Does that make sense to you?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's just so uncanny. You know, I mean, people like Mae Brussel, as you know, I put that in our trailer, and it's, you know, I've read some of her statements about the book and her considering it some of the most dangerous material in her library, which connects so much of the research. And she's a very formidable investigative researcher in the United States. I'm sure you're aware of who she is.
Oh yes, yeah, sure.
And you know, and the things like you know, there was this report by Johnson and Helbro. They published this NASA report in '75. They called it "Space Settlements: A Design Study," And the thing about that was really odd about it is that they wrote this whole thing in the past tense about settlements and transports to Mars and the moon and different places. And it could have been literally describing alternative 3. So, I mean, there are so many unusual parallels going on that it just, this is probably what led a lot of people to believe that you were, there's even theories out there that you were some kind of an agent planted to put the truth into the fictional domain so that they could hide it right out in the open.
Well, the sort of thing that there was a funny side to it as well, in a bleak sort of way, actually, Frank. As I think I indicated to you, received a mountain of mail and phone calls and goodness knows what, congratulated me on this fearless expose and so on, which it wasn't really. But a lot of these people were obviously very frightened. And there was one guy in particular who will always stick in my memory. He was from Manchester in the north of England. And he somehow got hold of my home telephone number and he rang me. And in that very distinctive Mancunian accent, he said, "I have to congratulate you on this wonderful bit of digging you've been doing to get the truth." And I could see he was a little bit anxious about something, so I hastened to reassure him. I said, "Look, before we go any further, let's be quite clear. This is not the truth. This is fiction." This is immediately after the book came out. He said, "Well, you've got to say that, haven't you? Because the authorities wouldn't like it if you didn't." I said, no, it really is fiction. And he said, "No, look, when you wrote that book, you had the courage to tell the truth, didn't you?" I said, "Well, I think I told the truth as far as I knew it, yes." He said, "But now you're obviously frightened of telling the truth because you've been got at. You've been got at by the authorities, haven't you?" I said, "Well, no, nobody's got at me." I said, "These people, the ones I talk about, most of them don't exist. I just made them up." He said, "Right, let me ask you a direct question. What about Brian Pendlebury?" I thought, who is Brian Pendlebury? And then it dawned on me, I said, "Hey, you're talking about a scientist from Manchester who is now living on Mars and working on Mars." I said, "What about Brian Pendlebury?" I said, "Well, don't worry about Brian Pendlebury because he doesn't exist. He never has existed. And what's more, there's nothing to say about Brian Pendlebury." He said, "Right, now I know you're lying." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" He said, "I know Brian Pendlebury exists because I've spoken to his father." I said, "You what?" He said, "I've spoken to his father." I said, "Well, how do you get hold of his father?" I made this character up. And he said, "You gave his father's name, didn't you?" He said his father's name was Dennis. And you said whereabouts they lived in Manchester. I said, "Yes." He said, "And I rang up this Dennis Pendlebury. He's the only one in the telephone book." And I was quite intrigued by this time. I said, You spoke to him?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what did Brian Pendlebury's father say?" He said, "Oh, it was disgusting." He said, "You are frightened. I can tell that by your voice. But that Mr. Pendlebury, he's so frightened, he won't even admit he's got a son called Brian." He said, "But I'll get the truth out of him, I'll keep at him until I do." And eventually, because I felt guilty about this, I phoned Mr. Pendlebury myself. And I apologized for any inconvenience I'd inadvertently caused. I'd made the name up, I thought.
Wow.
How do you cope with that?
Wow, that's amazing.
There was a guy who wrote to me from Arizona, actually, who, again, was concerned about what was happening. It was to do with flying saucers. And he reckoned that he'd written to authorities in America, but they just ignored him. And he couldn't get anybody interested in what he was doing. And he said, in the end, he said, "I wrote to John Wayne." because I thought he's a good American and he'll take me seriously and he'll be concerned about what's happening in this country. And even John Wayne didn't reply. You know, it's horrible, horrible. He said, I'm writing to you because I think you might be a sort of guy who would let me know what is really going on. And it was a long, long letter. I thought, oh gosh, I've got to reply to this one. And I started to draft out a long letter explaining a lot to him. Then I suddenly found why nobody ever replied to him. He said he was in Arizona, but he didn't put any address on any of his letters at all. So nobody could reply to him. I mean, there was some quirky things, but there were also some rather nasty things as well, you know, where people were genuinely upset. There's nothing I could do about it. That was why I put a message up on the internet, as you possibly know, to say that I may have accidentally stumbled on the truth, but I didn't know.
How does that make you feel then when you find out that you've had such a profound effect on people who just refuse to believe it's fiction? Did you ever feel like you were being manipulated or sort of subconsciously influenced in any way, shape, or form? You know, there's people talking about how, mind control technology is capable of even remotely, and you talk about this, in Alternative 3, about the people that are, they're disposed of by making them see something in a dream that they have, and they get up and they do something like jump off a building because they think they're on fire or whatever.
This is true, yes.
Have you ever thought maybe that, since you seem to have stumbled on a lot of this stuff in your book?
Well, that is the subject of another book which I'm bringing out later on this year. It's called The Sleepwalker Killers, and it's about people who have been charged with murder and acquitted because they were fast asleep at the time. And in that, I go into that very subject. I'm calling it murder by remote control, because people can be instructed through their dreams or whatever, or hypnotized, in fact, to commit murder. There's no question about that. It can happen, and I think it does happen as well. It has happened, actually. So this is a subject which certainly interests me.
Yes.
But I've done a lot of research on that one, a great deal of research. And some of the things that happen with sleepwalking is quite amazing. One elderly gentleman in Florida, age 77, and he'd been sleepwalking since the age of 13, and the neighbors all took it. He used to get up and wander around the area, and the neighbors took it as a bit of a joke almost. There goes old Joe on his travels again. One night, 2 o'clock in the morning, they're all awoken by him screaming, and by God, he was screaming for help, because he'd wandered out with his walking stick, and there was a huge pond not all that far away, and he got stuck in this pond, and that was when he woke up. And he couldn't get out of the pond because it was thick mud at the bottom. And this is in the end of the book. And I've got his name, everything else. And all around him were alligators snapping at him. And he was trying to fend them off with his walking stick. And the neighbors had to go down and beat them back and rescue him.
Wow.
And some of the things that are happening are quite astonishing. And that's intrigued me. I don't know if it's mind control on me. I hope not. I mean, I know I'm a Welshman, and Welshmen are supposed to be susceptible to that sort of thing. I don't know who ever decided that was true, but I don't know.
Well, people have often asked me in interviews whether I've been, whether I've ever had the feeling that I'm in danger, or that my research was being blocked, or if there were some steps being taken to prevent me finishing the film. And Tanya and I, when we started, when she joined up on the project shortly after I started it, we made a policy to keep it quiet, to the point where, because it was such a controversial idea, just like, you know, when you wrote Alternative 3, you didn't figure anyone would ever believe an outrageous thesis like this. But when I was working on this, I couldn't tell anybody about it either. And Tanya and I we'd keep it quiet. We didn't even tell our relatives, our family members, our friends.
Is that so?
And
that's interesting. My gosh, that is interesting.
You know, because we just felt that if you keep it, you know, we did a film prior to Packing for Mars that's called Solar Revolution, which is a documentary film based on scientific research that delves into the idea of humans being, the potential of human beings being unlocked by cosmic events, in particular.
Yes.
And one of the gentlemen we interviewed for the film was Michael Persinger, who's like a neuroscientist in Sudbury, Ontario. He was a professor at the university there, who invented something called the God helmet, which was a helmet called the God helmet because he put it on people's head and he had very subtle electromagnetic fields around the brain stimulated with very, very weak energy pulses. And he could induce a state of consciousness in people where they believed that they were sitting among masters and they were in another reality altogether. And we realized then that essentially the technology has been developed to, you know, to subtly influence people with electromagnetic fields. And so we figured the best way to kind of keep our environment free from contaminants, let's say, because, you know, I think the only thing I could say that ever really negatively influenced me in the course of making any films or anything was, you know, my own feelings of confidence or my own feelings of self-worth, or is this project worth doing? And then you can easily talk yourself out of something as well, especially when you're undertaking something as complicated as a film. You get into such, it's such a master of many trades. You know, you've got your finger in a lot of different things to make it all congeal into a watchable document. I mean, if it looks really simple in the end, you know, you've done your job, but believe me, it's not simple putting it together.
Well, that's one of the things with writing. It's got to look as if it's absolutely simple.
Yes, that's what I like.
You know, the writer may have struggled for an hour with one paragraph, but it's got to look as if it's just flown, whoops, straight off the pen, you know?
That's right, that's right. So tell me, like, what are some of the other sources that you encountered in the process of researching Alternative 3?
Well, first of all, I tried with various, before I saw the film, the television program, that is, I did talk to a number of politicians. And you saw what Clancarty, I think I told you about this before, the Earl of Clancarty. As soon as the book came out, the first call I had actually was from the Earl of Clancarty, who congratulated me on this amazing investigation. And what he said was rather significant. He said, we've known, he was a member of the House of Lords. We've known, of course, for some time a bit about what's going on here, but we did not know the full story until we read your book. And now tell me, where did you get this information from? And I told him the same as I told everybody else, that it was fiction. And he wouldn't believe me. And dear old Brinsley, as you call him, you told me to call him, met up with me time and time again. He invited me to his home and we went out for dinner together. And every time he said, look, you know me well enough, old boy, now you can tell me the truth. Where did you get the information about this, that, and the other from? And even before I wrote it, I'd had this feeling that there was something odd going on. And I knew pretty well a number of well-known politicians in England. And I did approach one or two of them, and I can think of three names in particular, about what was going on. Each time I had a similar sort of response as I had from Clancarty. Well, we know that there's something of that ilk going on, something odd going on, but that's all we know. We don't know any more about it, and what's more, we're not getting involved with it. and they all shuddered away from it. And I couldn't get any further with that at all. So there was nothing much more I could do about it. The only other research I could do, obviously, was to look at some of the, and you'll have gathered from this morning's little fiasco at my end, that I know nothing about technical things at all. So I had to do a bit of research about some of the methods of space travel and all that sort of thing. But nothing very deep or significant, quite frankly, Frank.
So you were just, you were letting it stream. I guess, you're probably, as a writer, like many artists are, you get into a zone, and in this zone, you actually are tapping into information which, you don't necessarily have to have studied. And this is, referencing
exactly
what I'd said earlier with Michael Persinger, is that he made it clear to us that every thought, action, or deed, or anything that we've ever generated as a human being is actually recorded in the magnetosphere of the Earth, which is like a giant cloud computer storing everything that's ever been done. So that's a pretty cool concept when you think about when you're writing something and you go into that zone and you suddenly get, I don't know how it is with you, but in my case, I often hear, if it's music, I hear a melody or I hear words, or if it's a film or some kind of a narration I'm writing, I suddenly get a crystal clear, almost like I'm picking up a station, and I get the very clear feeling that this is it. This is not, something I needed to think much about. It just flowed through.
Now, there's a very good, I think, explanation for this. Our conversation at the moment is audible to both of us, and in 10 minutes' time, it will have, as far as you and I are concerned, apart from the fact it's being recorded, it will have disappeared forever. We wouldn't be able to hear what we're now saying in 10 minutes' time. But where does it go? It's still in the ether there. The words are still in the ether. They don't just disappear totally. They linger, and they go into that great mush of unheard sound, which is all around us all the time. And just occasionally, as if there's a huge cloud of sound, which is music. It goes back maybe before you and I were, long before you and I were born. The sounds that were made, the roar of a lion, the shout of a tyrant, or whatever, they just didn't die totally. They're somewhere there in the sound waves, which are like light waves. Now, just occasionally, I talk about a cloud of it. Little puffball of that cloud can break away, as indeed, up in the sky there, you get a little bit of cloud drifting away. And suddenly, it has its own identity. And that's when you hear, hello, I thought I heard somebody say something then. That's something could have been said 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Could have been done 100 years ago. Am I making sense, or am I talking nonsense? But it seems to me that that is quite possible.
Everything that you're saying has been backed by science now, and it's, in the film there's that whole section. We have Ernst Sinkowski, the German professor of physics, talking about the chronovisor, and the chronovisor is nothing else but a tool that was invented to be able to tap into this reverberation of originally it was sound. It was something they tried to carry, they tried to pick up voices with. And eventually they were able to pick up pictures and voices in a kind of holographic projection, which they even filmed and they presented to the Vatican and some of the leaders in the Italian brass. And it was so shocking to them to be able to know that they could actually film historical events as they happened, because it's been stored, that they basically confiscated and seized this device, and it disappeared.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, and
that is fascinating.
Of course, later we learned that even though the Vatican seized it at the time, it somehow did resurface in the possession of DARPA, the United States, Defense initiative that basically took these secret programs and developed them even further. And one of the people in our film, of course, talks about having been a member of a research group of children that were using this chronovisor in its later incarnation to teleport. And it's just a fantastic story. Of course, it sounds like science fiction, except I know that the chronovisor is a real thing and it really did happen. And you know that if there's a technology which had some early beginnings 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, and there was people that had an unlimited source of funds and researchers to put into that project, that you can be pretty much certain that they developed that project a lot further. And they didn't necessarily tell us about what the results of that research was.
Well, let me put another thought to you. You and I, every other living human being, has got, I think, two bodies. We got a physical body, we got a spiritual body. And on death, they part. Okay, we know what happens to the physical body. It gets buried, it gets burnt, whatever. But that doesn't mean to say that the other spiritual us dies automatically. Now then, who gets bereaved? People lose a loved one and they feel bereaved. But the one who has gone, maybe prematurely, could also feel bereaved because they are still alive in another form. And would it be unnatural then for them not to want to communicate with the people that they have missed?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And this is where you get the stories of the voices from the dead, voices from the grave, messages from the grave, or whatever. And I think that is quite possible. Quite possible.
Yes, and this is the thing that Ernst Sinkowski was involved in researching. He was one of the leading researchers in recording those voices, which were coming through, in static on tape recordings, even on telephones. While people were having conversations on telephones, there's documented cases where another voice went into their conversation and began communicating. So
yeah, there was a book on this, wasn't there, called Voices, Telephone Calls from the Dead.
Yes, exactly. I think it was a German case. And this is basically, I think there's enough evidence to state pretty clearly that even if we leave our physical bodies the way they are now, it's not the end of our consciousness. And,
oh, no.
And we just don't have the tools or the belief system or the structure around us to really see past this five senses and the fourth dimensional reality we're living and inhabiting. But we have to realize the fact that we only really see maybe 0.5% of the entire known universe. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a lot of stuff is still coming and coming out. We're opening ourselves up slowly to it. So I think, it's important to put these informations and these ideas into a form for me personally. And I guess, I can sort of relate to you in that way too, because I kind of feel that's what you do. You take information which has been mulling around in your mind, and you need to kind of create a vehicle to express that in a way that is understandable. And so, because it'll create discussion, it'll bring it out into the forefront, and people cannot really adopt these ideas unless they're talking about them. Because if you don't believe any of this stuff, then of course, if you just say, I don't believe it, well, you'll never experience it.
Not necessarily just about the past either. Because, the theory of the river of time. And I'm looking now at possible things from the future. You know that there have been several well-documented cases of people predicting accurately things that are going to happen. The assassination in, there's only been one major political assassination in Britain, and that was a guy called Spencer Percival. And he was killed by a man called Bellingham. This is going back in the last century before last. What intrigued me here was and this is very well documented, that killing, the shooting in the House of Commons was witnessed in a dream by a banker in Cornwall. And he had the same dream 3 nights running. And he was so concerned about it, he talked to all his friends, he talked to his wife about it, and should he go up to London to warn the Prime Minister? And he was told, no, look, they'll just say you're an idiot. No, don't go, no. So he didn't. And Percival was shot dead, and he went up to London, as a hell of a lot of people did, to pay homage at the funeral. And while he was up there, he bought an etching. And in that etching, it was an etching of the actual killing. And it was exactly, you'd never seen the Prime Minister before. I've seen a picture of him even. It was exactly as he had seen it in his dream. And there are so many cases like this. John Lennon's death was predicted, as you probably know, well before he died. His assassination was predicted 3 times, actually, by 3 different people. And it is possible to look into the future. I don't understand how. I don't understand how these things can possibly happen. But I'm sure they do.
Yes, absolutely. I think they do. And it's not necessarily important for us to understand how they happen. I think that there's a lot of people that are beginning to delve into the research to explain why they happen. And there's a lot of existing mathematical models like Burkhard Heim's 12-dimensional reality, and that have a very solid mathematical foundation that explains a lot of these events, that can tie spiritual events together with, practical real events in the world, and hard, touchable matter with fine, invisible matter. And I think all this stuff is, they're exciting times that we're living in right now. I think we're kind of reaching a point where I like to call it like the tsunami of truth. And a part of the job that Tanya and I see in the films that we make is to kind of stimulate or bring the information that we don't really get in the mainstream media so much to groups of people who need to see it. I mean, we get a lot of people that see our films and they write us and they say, I've been carrying this stuff around in my head for years and my family think I'm crazy, but I bought this film and I sat them down and they watched it and they were silent. They didn't say anything because they couldn't argue with the science of it, And I think it's great times that we're living in where we're able to, kind of have a renaissance of free thought and free thinking. I mean, in some parts of the world, let's face it, there's a lot of parts in the world where there's still a lot of oppression going on.
Oh, absolutely. And the tsunami you're talking about is getting, the waves are getting bigger and bigger every year.
So, I mean, I wanted to ask you, at 85 years young, I believe, right? Am I correct in that? You're a man of some experience and wisdom. What do you make of the world that we live in now? I mean, what are your thoughts about some of the things that are going on now? We have like everything from Donald Trump to potential war to an economic collapse.
The world is reaching a final crisis, I think. And I think that, I hate to say it, but I think that the alternative 3 solution is going to become absolutely essential. It's not going to be the alternative 3 solution because it's not going to work that way. I mean, there's no room up there for the technology. I don't think is there to reproduce everything we've got here and certainly to evacuate everybody. But I think that this world is coming to an end. I'm not talking about this year. I'm not talking about this week or this month or whatever. But I'm talking about certainly in the next 150 years. I think this world will gone.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to seem to point in that direction. What gives me hope is what I learned from working with, biophysicist, the German biophysicist Dieter Brers, who, we worked on this film I was telling you about, Solar Revolution.
Yes.
what I liked about his thesis was because I personally am skeptical about a voluntary evolution of my fellow humans. I think somehow from an early age, I felt I was living in a world of sort of insane politicians and warmongers, and I didn't know, how to deal with it. But I feel hope when I find out that there is actually this, as the Mayas may have called it, the Hunab Ku, this ray coming from the center of our galaxy, which is just flooding us with plasma and electromagnetic radiation, and it's affecting our DNA. It's affecting our brain waves, and it's actually having an effect on the pineal gland, which is a gland, as you may know, that produces some very, very powerful mind-altering substances, which usually dissipate in a few hours after we wake up from our dreams and whatnot. But this, this stimulation that we're going through seems to be indicating that there's going to be some kind of a shift in consciousness, at least for maybe a minority of people, that will begin to possibly spontaneously have an awakened state of consciousness. So that's what I'm hoping for in terms of the future, so that maybe there is some hope. Possibly there's already people who have taken steps to get away from it all, but I'd like to sort of hope that there is still a chance that we can kind of I think we're due for an evolution, because if you look at the human mind and the consciousness we have today, I lived in Salzburg, the birth town of Mozart, the famous composer. And, I was looking at some of his letters that he was writing to his family when he was 15 and 16 years old. And the guy was super intelligent. I mean, he was very, very smart. And he was talking about highly spiritual concepts. And he was already into, Masonic ideas and what people now would call New Age, consciousness ideas back, 250 years ago. So if that was possible, and look at the music he composed. I mean, people aren't even really, in the state of consciousness to be able to manifest that kind of music nowadays, so many, and so I think it's safe to say that, that state of consciousness existed centuries ago. We need another leap in consciousness so that we can make another level, because we actually, I think we have the capacity. It's proven we have the potential. So I'm hoping that leap does actually happen.
Yeah, but where will the leap take us to, though, Frank?
It might actually take us to another dimension. Another.
Oh, I'm with you. Yeah, I'm with you entirely. I've got the picture.
So it's like I like to make the analogy of us being on a train. If you're on if you leave the Munich train station, and there's about 20 tracks side by side, and for a long time, if the trains were all to leave simultaneously, they'd be riding parallel with each other, and you would see the other people on the other trains. And if you think of those people on those trains as the people in society around you, and you can see them, if you're on a kind of a timeline in a dimension that's taking you somewhere on another track, eventually those train tracks are going to get further and further apart, and suddenly it's not like they vanish from one day to the next, but all of a sudden, one moment you realize that they're all gone, and all that's left is the people that are with you on your train.
Yeah. Well, talking about transport, I mean, that was John Lennon's comment, wasn't it? I'm not afraid of death because I don't believe in it. It's just a question of stepping out of one car and into another.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was a pretty shrewd, deep comment, really.
One more thing I wanted to ask you was, you said, essentially that after the outrage of the book and all the letters you got, you were inspired to try and write a follow-up novel. You want to tell us a little bit about what happened there and some of that?
Yeah, sure. There's not a great deal I can tell you about that, because what happened here was, can you still see me, by the way?
Absolutely, I can still see you.
Yeah, because all I've got at the moment is a blank, a white screen. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What happened there was that I had a stack of letters, and I mean a stack, huge pile of them, from obviously highly intelligent and responsible people confirming a lot of what I'd written in the book, particularly about UFOs and government secrecies and so on and so on. And I thought there's enough material here to really do another book, which I was going to call Backlash to Alternative 3. And I was, at that time, I was moving from England down to Australia, where I was going to be editor-in-chief of Reader's Digest. But anyway, a lot of my stuff went by boat, and most of it turned up in Sydney. One or two things disappeared, only one or two things, and one of them was a little box about, I don't know, it's about a bit bigger than a shoe box. And it was a very distinctive little box, actually, with a red dragon engraved on the lid. And all the letters I put in there, together with notes I had for the book. And among the things that disappeared, and nobody could explain why, on that voyage, was that little box. There were one or two other small things disappeared as well. And I was insured, and they paid me out for the box and the value of the box and one or two of the other odds and ends. But everything I had prepared for the book, and I couldn't start from scratch without the letters, because I was going to quote chunks from Joe Bloggs or whoever it was, said so-and-so. While at the same time, so-and-so in Ohio saw this, and quote that. But that was irretrievable. So that book never got written.
So any
that was all there was to it.
Anything pop up in mind that you still...
Sorry?
Are there any, maybe a couple of things that still sort of lingered in your memory in terms of that were profound enough for you to...
They were mainly about flying saucers. People who were puzzled by the government denying there were such things as flying saucers, because these people had seen them, and it was mainly that type of thing, really. There were also a few concerned about people who disappeared, but I mean that could have been coincidental. I mean, people disappear all the time for all sorts of good reasons, to avoid their debtors, to get away from their wives, or whatever. But there's nothing else that, this is going back 40 years now. There's nothing else I can really recall. I would say, that was significant, to be honest, Frank.
So do you have any, you're republishing some of your books now. Is there anything new that you've got that you want to tell us about that's coming in the pipeline?
Yeah, the Sleepwalk Killers is one which I am working on at this moment, and I'm very excited about it. It's got so much new material in that it amazes me, actually, the stuff that I'm digging up now about the amazing things that people do when they're fast asleep. And I think it's a heck of a good subject, actually. And it's certainly a fascinating subject. It's also quite a frightening subject in some ways. The Unexploded Man, well, all I've done there is updated the original, which was quite successful in its own way. And the next one I'll be working on is, as you possibly know, I was in prison for a while in Uganda. I was going to be executed at one stage as a suspected British spy. So I wrote a novel called The Killing of Idi Amin, which got published when he was still president of Uganda. And that needs updating, because the story is so intricate that I think it is worth retelling.
It's great to hear that you're still so inspired to continue working on all this stuff. And it's really fascinating that you wrote these novels, over 35, 40 years ago, which seem to be as current and fresh as they were written today, which is something I think that is just marvels, boggles the imagination that, and led me to ask you if you were indeed a time traveler in the very beginning of our conversation. So, I guess you know, Tanya really would have loved to be here and meet you as well. I'm supposed to extend a warm greetings to you as well.
Yeah, well, please give her my regards as well, because, you know, from what I gather, she sounds a very lovely, talented lady.
She is. She's extremely.
I'd love to have been talking with her as well, obviously. But is there anything else I can help you with there, Frank?
I think we've covered a lot of material, Les. I think this has been a very interesting interview, and it's been, for me, just really great to get, you know, it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, you know, the story, to sort of uncover some of the mythology and be one of the first people really ever. And I think it's really kind of a historic coup that you and I are having this conversation today. And
well, I think so.
And I really, you know, I really want to thank you, and I hope that it's only the first of many interactions that we have with one another.
That'd be fantastic.
I think you've inspired me to maybe have a couple of other interviews with some of the other people that I wanted to, actually that's what I wanted to tell you, because, you know, after we released Packing for Mars, we were approached by other whistleblowers that confirm a lot of the stuff in our film and even connect the dots for them too, just like the way you were approached by politicians who said that you connected a lot of dots for them as well. So, and maybe some of those conversations are going to have to be interviews like the one we just had tonight, and we'll just keep the dialogue going.
Oh, fantastic.
Okay, well,
okay.
Without
Frank,
further
thank
ado,
you. Thank you so much for all your interest. I do appreciate it. I'm so sorry that I'm a total idiot when it comes to technical things with computers. But I mean, I even had to go to evening class to learn how to use a ballpoint pen, you know, and I failed the course. So, I mean, that tells you everything.
No worries, no worries. Everything went well. Okay,
put it down to me being a Welshman.
I'll do that.
My friend, thank you so much for your call.
Have a great day.
And yourself. I'll do that. Well, have a great night now.
I'm going tonight, exactly. So I'll meet you in the future.
Yes, please. I look forward to that.
Take it easy.
Cheers out.
Cheers.